Over the last several years, vintage-inspired watches have sort of reigned supreme in the watch market. It feels like every other day a new vintage-inspired watch has come out. But in the last year or so, we feel like we have reached a certain pinnacle of the vintage-inspired market. We have a few watches here that represent where we are now, and then we can talk about where we think we're going to go from there. I'm Zach Weiss, co-founder of Worn & Wound.
I'm Zach Kazan, managing editor of Worn & Wound.
And yeah, let's talk the state of vintage-inspired watches.
Yeah.
So Zach, briefly, where do you think we are in the world of the state of vintage-inspired market?
I feel like we're turning a corner. It feels like, when I started doing this full time, which was about 4 years ago or so, it felt like every press release that I got was about some sort of vintage-inspired reissue of some. Watch from the 1960s mostly. Mm-hmm. I see less of those. There are fewer watches kind of in that, in that sort of language now than there were even a few years ago. So I think we really had a good solid decade, maybe a little more than that, of the market just being really saturated with vintage reissue watches or vintage-inspired watches. And I think we're starting to see a segment of the market that kind of came of age with those sorts of watches, looking for other things, whether that's completely new designs or maybe looking to other eras besides the 60s, maybe more, slightly more contemporary periods.
Yeah, so the mid-century vintage was really the pinnacle for a long time. I think starting with mid-century divers, really, kind of at the center of it for a little while, and then turned into chronographs. And we have here the Black Bay 54, so my personal watch. Mm-hmm. And when I reviewed this, I did talk about it as potentially, for what I think of as vintage-inspired, as being a peak for vintage inspiration. It looks like a vintage watch in scale, in style. Mm-hmm. But it's thoroughly modern on the inside, somewhat on the outside, but it's not made out of modern materials, this one in particular. And it's from here, what else can you do? Mm-hmm. You can't make it more vintage, and they've really gone to great lengths to put a very modern engine in it with, the silicone hairspring and everything, 72-hour power reserve. So it's for brands like TUDOR, or brands that are relying on this mid-century dive watch style, how much more can they do? And I think that it's limited now.
Yeah.
And you're going to start getting away from it. This is as good as it gets.
You feel like it's kind of perfected that era, even though it wasn't necessarily the winner of the Thunderdome.
Yes, well,
that style of watch.
Yeah.
I think we can say those watches, in the black, the most recent incarnation of Black Bays, I think, all kind of similarly represent sort of a peak in that sort of design language pulling from the past.
And I just think about a day when we used to fight for a 40 millimeter watch, and then a 39, and then a 38, and now we have a 37 millimeter dive watch that is universally accepted. That is, that is kind of it. You can't just reduce forever, right? It's getting back to those vintage proportions and the vintage charm, and I think brands have figured it out.
And you also still have a choice of if you want those larger watches, and they're executed, at a similarly high level. So that's the other factor here, is that you really can get everything you want now. Everything that enthusiasts and collectors were begging for over the course of the last decade, it's basically all available now. Plus you've got all the stuff that people had little issues with too. If that seemed to be the perfect fit for you, you can still have that.
Yeah, this is an interesting example too so this is the newest watch on the table, though obviously aesthetically you wouldn't know it.
Yep. So this is a Tissot. What's the reference?
It's the PR516.
The PR516. So this watch is a brand new release. It's been getting quite a bit of play in the enthusiast community. People seem to really be gravitating to it, enjoying it. And it's a really nice design. This is based on a loosely kind of based on 70s design codes. It's a manually wound chronograph with, I think, a really nice case size and shape, very wearable. I've reviewed Tissot chronographs in the past. We can link to them in the description. And they're always like quite chunky. And they made a smart decision here of giving us a hand wound movement, so it's just a little bit thinner, still with like a lot of presence. But it really is kind of like a more wearable option, pulling from a slightly different era.
And I think this, once again, sort of represents that sort of peak, because Tissot is a Swatch Group brand. They're not just catering to enthusiasts, they're catering to a much larger market. And I think they shied away for a while from some of the some of the things that enthusiasts really wanted, like because they might not make a watch easier to sell. So, you know, in this instance, you have a manual winding watch, which versus, oh, why would that be better than an automatic? Well, it's about the feel of it, right? Maybe it's about shaving a little bit off. Not the thinnest watch, it's 13.6 or 7 or so without the crystal on here, but not obnoxious either. Scale-wise, I think it's around 40 millimeters. So it's, you know, these used to always be 42 or 44, and you'd be like, oh, I love the look of that, but it's just a bit too big. Like they brought it all down, and it's date free, and it's got all these things. Yeah, we really would beg for, and they made it. And once again, it's like seeing a company as big as Tissot adopt all of these things. Like how much more can we expect or ask for? You want the vintage looking watch, you got the vintage looking watch.
Yep, and it arrives in a market that has slowed down a little bit in this particular niche. So I think it benefits from that and gets a little bit more attention because of that. And again, it's a watch that people seem to be gravitating towards on social media. It's a object of discussion.
It's also under $2,000.
Yeah,
I think
very
it's worth
good price
mentioning
point.
That, getting all those things combined, Swiss-made mechanical chronograph under 2K, also was just a challenge at a certain point. So this is maybe a representation of like where we have been for a little while, kind of hitting a peak of like the tech here, the size here, and the affordability, and sort of just the cues for the enthusiast here. What is this?
So this is the RAnatom, which is a reimagining of a watch with its roots in the 1980s. And I think it's an interesting watch to kind of bring into the conversation with these vintage-inspired watches and vintage reissue watches, because that's really what this is, but it's not from a mid-century sort of like design space. This is from an era where many of us can remember, watches from this era, and it's it's a sign of the times. The years march on. Vintage gets a little bit more recent to us in terms of perspective as the years go by, and I'm wondering if this is maybe like a precursor or the sign of a trend, if you want to call it that, of brands looking back to a slightly more contemporary era of vintage, right where that like vintage contemporary line sort of exists, and bringing back watches and watch designs and principles of design that are not really related to those mid-century design codes, a little bit more contemporary, focused on maybe 80s or even early 90s designs, focused on materials, and not necessarily watches that are so overtly sporty in nature.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see, especially since we had a pretty quick and intense integrated bracelet sort of era, which is the 70s, feeling like that's what everyone honed in on. So mid-century to the 70s with that, and then where do you go? And it's frankly kind of brave, because this is not a watch that I think a lot of people are familiar with, so it's not like it's a universal icon that everyone is wanting to find vintage. It's a strange watch, interesting case design, and very, very 80s, and it's a little terrifying as mid-80s born individuals that that is now an era to focus back to. But I agree, it's sort of the end of when vintage was, and not just because of the time, decades, whatever. We have the neo-vintage 90s, early 2000s, but at a certain point, I think the design, it kind of equalized, and go on much further, and you're going to be reissuing reissues. The idea of what was new sort of stopped. There's a lot of watches from around 2000 where I think they sort of perfected the tool watch, which I don't think they need to remake so much as remember what they once did, but that's maybe a conversation for another day.
And also, a lot of those watches are still being made. There's no need to remake them. Many of them are still in production, because it hasn't been that long in the span of watchmaking. 20 years is nothing. So.
Where do you think we're going to go from here? Do you think vintage watches or vintage inspiration watches are going to be cleared out entirely, and we're just going to see modern, or is it really going to be this sort of finding the last corners of what's left, or I don't know, something else, something in between?
Well, I think I don't mean to hedge here, but I think it'll be a little bit of everything, kind of a little from column A, a little from column B. I think that consumers will dictate, what happens. They'll vote with their dollars. They'll buy, if they're interested in buying watches with a clear mid-century inspiration, they'll continue to do that. And if they do, brands will continue to make watches kind of in that mold. But I really think, just kind of based on conversations I've had with collectors and what I'm just seeing on Instagram and elsewhere, I do think that there's a movement towards other eras and other sort of like design codes, and people are just less less pulled in by that kind of like standard black dial dive watch sort of like 1960s flavored sports watch kind of thing. People want something different. They're looking for the next thing, looking to individualize their own collection. So I think that offers an opportunity for brands to pull from different eras, maybe slightly more contemporary eras. Yeah. And I would be totally fine if the 80s got a second look. I think that's fun.
Yeah, for sure. So that's where we think the vintage-inspired market is going. But we'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Well, are we done with vintage? Are we going straight modern? Is there still room for the mid-century dive watch in new watch collections? Please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.